He's just a farmer's son. He doesn't belong at Westridge Academy." The arrogant principal's words still echoed across campus when 3 military helicopters thundered overhead the next morning. His jaw dropped as decorated officers in full uniform marched toward his office. "We're here about Ethan Taylor," the stern-faced commander announced, "and you have some explaining to do. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Westridge Academy stood like a fortress against the crisp blue October sky. Its imposing brick facade and perfectly manicured grounds projected an image of academic excellence and exclusivity that had defined the prestigious boarding school for over a century. Wrought iron gates bearing the school's shield, a falcon, clutching a quill, guarded the entrance, along with the Latin motto Excellentia per traditionem, excellence through tradition. For generations, Westridge had educated the children of politicians, business magnates, and old money families, a fact that headmaster Dr. Lawrence Hargrove never tired of mentioning during his meticulously orchestrated tours for prospective parents. At 58, with a perpetually stern expression and silver-streaked dark hair, Dr. Hargrove had overseen Westridge's climb to the number 3 spot in national rankings during his 12-year tenure. This achievement stemmed largely from his ruthless selectivity about which families were deemed Westridge material. October sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of his oak-paneled office, illuminating walls covered with framed photographs of Dr. Hargrove alongside famous alumni, certificates from educational associations, and an oil painting of the school's founder, Bartholomew Westridge. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked solemnly, marking time for his 10 a.m. disciplinary hearing, one he had been eagerly anticipating since the incident in the dining hall yesterday. Dr. Hargrove straightened his crimson and navy Westridge tie as his assistant, Mrs. Winters, knocked softly before opening the heavy mahogany door. "The Taylors are here, sir," she announced, her voice carrying a hint of discomfort. "Send them in," he replied with a thin smile that failed to reach his eyes. "And perhaps have maintenance on standby. I suspect there might be mud." Jack Taylor entered first, his 6'2" frame seeming momentarily too large for the ornate office. Despite his obvious attempt to dress appropriately in a clean button-down shirt and his least-worn pair of jeans, Dr. Hargrove immediately noted the man's weathered face, calloused hands, and the slight awkwardness with which he carried himself in such formal surroundings. Behind him came his son, Ethan Taylor, a lean 16-year-old with intelligent grey eyes and light brown hair that fell across his forehead. He wore the Westridge uniform, navy blazer and grey slacks, though his tie hung slightly askew. While his clothing matched his classmates, there was something undeniably different about his bearing, a quiet self-assurance that came from somewhere beyond these privileged halls. "Good morning," Dr. Hargrove said, remaining seated as he gestured to the leather chairs across from his massive mahogany desk. "Please make yourselves comfortable." Jack Taylor sat with the careful movements of someone unused to such luxurious furnishings. "Thank you for seeing us, Dr. Hargrove. We appreciate the opportunity to discuss what happened yesterday. And, yes, well," the headmaster interrupted, reaching for a folder with Ethan's name on it. "Let's get right to it, shall we? My schedule is quite full today." He made a show of flipping through the pages, though he had already reviewed the incident report thoroughly and made his decision. Ethan sat quietly beside his father, his expression composed but watchful, as the headmaster began his assessment. "Mr. Taylor," Dr. Hargrove said, directing his words to Ethan while occasionally glancing at Jack. "Yesterday's incident in the dining hall was a serious violation of Westridge's code of conduct. Physical altercations of any kind are strictly prohibited, as clearly stated in the handbook that all students and parents sign upon admission." Jack Taylor leaned forward slightly. "Sir, if I may, my son was defending another student who was being bullied. From what Ethan told me and what several witnesses have confirmed, he intervened only after verbal attempts to stop the situation. Failed." Dr. Hargrove's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Taylor, at Westridge Academy, we have proper channels for addressing behavioral concerns. If your son witnessed inappropriate conduct, he should have notified a faculty member immediately rather than taking matters into his own hands." "There wasn't time." Ethan spoke up, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "James Preston was shoving Max Chen against the wall. A teacher wasn't present, and it was escalating quickly." "Ah, yes, James Preston," Dr. Hargrove said, his tone shifting subtly. "The son of Senator Preston, one of our most distinguished alumni and board members. I've spoken with James as well, and he claims the interaction with Mr. Chen was merely spirited conversation." Jack Taylor's weathered face reddened slightly. "With all due respect, sir, shoving someone against a wall goes beyond spirited conversation. Several students have confirmed what really happened." Dr. Hargrove folded his hands on the desk. "And I have taken those accounts into consideration. James will receive appropriate consequences for his role. However, Mr. Taylor," he looked pointedly at Ethan, "your response was disproportionate and reflects a concerning lack of understanding about how matters are handled at an institution of Westridge's caliber. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now, back to the story. Ethan maintained eye contact with the headmaster. "I pulled James away and stood between them. I didn't hit him or shove him back. I just stopped him from hurting Max." "According to James, you threatened him," Dr. Hargrove countered. "I told him to back off," Ethan clarified. "I didn't threaten him." Dr. Hargrove leaned back in his leather chair. "Regardless, this incident raises larger concerns about your fit within the Westridge community. Your academic performance, while adequate, doesn't fully compensate for this sort of frontier justice approach to conflict resolution." The grandfather clock ticked loudly in the moment of tense silence that followed. Jack Taylor's hands gripped the armrests of his chair, knuckles whitening slightly. "What exactly are you suggesting, Dr. Hargrove?" Jack asked quietly. The headmaster's tone became one of practiced regret. "I believe a 2-week suspension is warranted, during which time the disciplinary committee and I will evaluate whether Ethan's continued enrollment at Westridge is in everyone's best interest." "A suspension?" Jack's voice rose slightly. "For stopping a bully? What about James Preston?" "As I mentioned, James will receive appropriate consequences," Dr. Hargrove replied smoothly. "A detention commensurate with his actions." "A detention versus a potential expulsion," Jack said, disbelief evident in his tone. "That hardly seems equitable." "Equity, Mr. Taylor, must take into account the totality of circumstances," Dr. Hargrove replied, his condescension barely concealed. "James comes from a family with a long Westridge legacy. His momentary lapse in judgment must be weighed against his family's contributions to this institution and his otherwise exemplary record." Ethan, who had remained composed throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "So it's not really about what happened. It's about who my family is, or isn't." Dr. Hargrove's smile tightened. "I've made my decision based on a holistic review. The suspension begins immediately. You may gather your essential belongings from your dormitory, and we'll be in touch. Regarding the committee's final determination," he stood abruptly, signaling the end of the meeting. "Mrs. Winters will provide the necessary paperwork on your way out." Jack Taylor rose slowly, his expression a careful mask. "Dr. Hargrove, my son earned his place at this school. His academic scholarship was based on merit, not family connections." Yes, the scholarship program, Dr. Hargrove replied with a dismissive wave. A commendable initiative, though perhaps we need to reconsider the adaptation period necessary for students from such different backgrounds. The cultural adjustment to Westridge can be challenging for those unaccustomed to our traditions. Ethan stood beside his father, his posture straight despite the clear dismissal. "Thank you for your time, Dr. Hargrove," he said with remarkable composure. "I'll collect my things." As they turned to leave, Dr. Hargrove added, "Mr. Taylor, I suggest using this suspension period to consider whether Ethan might be better served at an institution more aligned with his rural sensibilities. Perhaps the public school in your district would be more suitable." Jack paused at the door, looking back at the headmaster. "When my wife returns from her deployment next week, we'll discuss all options as a family." Dr. Hargrove gave a dismissive nod. "Yes, your wife is in the military, I recall. Well, I'm sure she'll understand the importance of discipline and proper channels of authority." As the door closed behind the Taylors, Dr. Hargrove returned to his desk with a satisfied sigh. Another problem nearly resolved. The scholarship program had been the board's idea, good for public relations and tax benefits, but integrating students from such ordinary backgrounds often proved problematic. Better to redirect them early rather than allow them to disrupt Westridge's carefully cultivated environment. His intercom buzzed. "Dr. Hargrove, Senator Preston is on line 1. Perfect timing." He would assure the senator that the situation had been handled appropriately, with minimal consequences for James. After all, maintaining relationships with families like the Prestons was essential to Westridge's continued prominence. "James, thank you for calling," he said warmly into the receiver. "I've just finished meeting with the Taylor boy and his father. Rest assured, the matter has been addressed decisively." Outside in the parking lot, Jack held the door of his weathered Ford pickup for his son. The truck, while meticulously maintained, was at least 15 years old, a stark contrast to the luxury vehicles filling the visitor spaces. As Ethan climbed in, Jack noticed his son's rigid posture, the only visible sign of his contained emotions. "I'm sorry, Dad," Ethan said quietly as Jack started the engine. "For what? Standing up for someone who needed help?" Jack shook his head. "I'm proud of you, son. But the scholarship—" "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," Jack interrupted. "Gently. We'll talk with your mom when she calls tonight. Nothing's decided yet." As they drove away from Westridge Academy, Ethan watched the imposing buildings recede in the side mirror. The opportunity to attend had seemed like a dream come true when he'd earned the full academic scholarship last spring, a chance at the kind of education and connections that could open doors far beyond their small farming community in Riverdale County. "He'd already made up his mind before we walked in," Ethan said finally, breaking the silence. "It didn't matter what I said." Jack gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. "People like Hargrove see what they expect to see, makes their world simpler." They drove in thoughtful silence as the manicured suburbs gave way to rolling countryside. Fields of harvested corn stretched out on either side of the highway, golden stubble catching the midday sun. After about 30 minutes, Jack turned onto a gravel road that led to their property, 60 acres of farmland that had been in the Taylor family for 3 generations. Their house was modest, but well-maintained, a 2-story farmhouse with a wide front porch. Behind it stood a red barn and several outbuildings. It wasn't grand like Westridge, but it was home, a place where work and character mattered more than pedigree. As they pulled into the driveway, Jack noticed Ethan checking his phone. "Everything okay?" Ethan nodded. "Just a text from Max Chen. He wanted to thank me and apologize about what happened. Says a bunch of students are upset about my suspension." "That's something, at least," Jack said as they walked toward the house. "Sounds like you made some real friends there, despite everything." Inside, the house was comfortable and lived in. Family photographs lined the walls, many featuring a woman in military uniform alongside Jack and Ethan at various ages. On the refrigerator, held by magnets, were Ethan's academic achievements and a recent letter with Army insignia at the top. "Your mum's going to call around 7 tonight," Jack said, checking his watch. "That gives us a few hours to figure out how we want to approach this." Ethan set his backpack down. "What if they kick me out, Dad? All the work to get that scholarship, all Mom's pride when I got accepted. For nothing." Jack placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Listen to me, Ethan. Your worth isn't determined by whether some stuck-up headmaster thinks you belong in his school. Whatever happens with Westridge, we'll figure it out together." Ethan nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "I should go unpack." As Ethan headed upstairs, Jack moved to the kitchen window, looking out over their land. The fall harvest was complete, the fields now resting before winter. He thought about his wife, Colonel Sarah Taylor, currently stationed overseas in a strategic leadership role. She had risen through Army ranks through sheer determination and intelligence, earning respect in a system that hadn't always welcomed women from rural backgrounds. Sarah would know how to handle this situation. She understood institutions and power dynamics in ways Jack never had. He glanced at the calendar on the wall. She was due home on leave in just 8 days. Dr. Hargrove had no idea who he was really dealing with. Later that evening, as promised, Sarah's video call came through. Despite being halfway around the world in an undisclosed location, her image showed a woman of commanding presence. At 43, Colonel Sarah Taylor's dark blonde hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and though she wore standard military fatigues, there was nothing standard about the intelligence in her eyes or the authority in her bearing. "Hey, farm boys," she said warmly, her face lighting up at the sight of her husband and son. "How's everything back home?" Jack and Ethan exchanged glances. "Actually, Mom, there's something we need to tell you," Ethan began, proceeding to explain. The entire situation, the incident with James Preston, the meeting with Dr. Hargrove, and the suspension. Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression growing increasingly serious. When Ethan finished, she was silent for a moment, her military training evident in her measured response. "Let me make sure I understand correctly," she said finally. "You intervened to protect another student from physical bullying. You used minimum necessary force, essentially just separation. And for this, you've been suspended for 2 weeks with the possibility of expulsion, while the instigator, who happens to be a senator's son, received detention." "That's about it," Jack confirmed. Dr. Hargrove made it pretty clear that the issue wasn't really what Ethan did. It was more about who he is, or rather who he isn't. Sarah's expression hardened slightly. "I see." "I'm sorry, Mom," Ethan said. "I know how hard you and Dad worked to help me get that scholarship." "Ethan, look at me," Sarah said firmly. "You have nothing to apologize for. You showed moral courage by standing up for someone who needed help. That's exactly what your father and I have taught you." Jack nodded in agreement. "That's what I told him." "As for Dr. Hargrove," Sarah continued, her tone shifting subtly, "it sounds like he needs a refresher course in leadership, ethical decision-making, and the consequences of discrimination." There was something in her voice that made both Jack and Ethan straighten slightly. "What are you thinking?" Jack asked, recognizing his wife's strategic expression. "I'm thinking it's fortunate that my leave got moved up," Sarah replied. "Instead of next week, I'll be arriving the day after tomorrow. Change of orders came through this morning. I was going to surprise you both." Ethan's face brightened. "Really? You're coming home early?" Sarah nodded. "And I think my first stop will be Westridge Academy. Dr. Hargrove and I need to have a conversation about values, leadership, and the true meaning of excellence." "Sarah," Jack said cautiously. "What exactly are you planning?" A smile played at the corner of her mouth. "Let's just say Dr. Hargrove has no idea who he's dealing with, and it's time he learned." The following morning, Dr. Hargrove arrived at Westridge Academy earlier than usual. The meeting with the Taylors had been satisfyingly straightforward, and Senator Preston had been appropriately grateful for the headmaster's handling of the situation. With any luck, the scholarship committee would agree that Ethan Taylor wasn't Westridge material, and they could redirect those funds to a more suitable candidate next term. As he entered the administrative building, Mrs. Winters approached with an unusual expression of concern. "Dr. Hargrove, there's been a rather unusual call," she said, her voice lower than normal. "Someone from the Department of Defense contacted the school regarding Ethan Taylor's suspension." Dr. Hargrove stopped mid-stride. "The Department of Defense? That's absurd. Why would they involve themselves in a routine disciplinary matter?" "I'm not entirely sure, sir, but they specifically mentioned an official visit tomorrow morning to discuss, and I quote, equity in educational disciplinary practices as they relate to military families." "Military families?" Dr. Hargrove repeated, baffled. "Oh, the mother is in the army or some such thing. Probably some mid-level officer trying to throw around what little weight she has. Nothing to be concerned about." Mrs. Winters hesitated. "Sir, they mentioned a delegation would be arriving by helicopter. They've requested permission to use the athletic field as a landing zone." "Helicopter?" Dr. Hargrove scoffed. "This is getting ridiculous. Deny the request, Mrs. Winters. Tell them to use proper channels through our legal department if they have concerns about school disciplinary policies." "I already tried, sir," Mrs. Winters replied, her discomfort growing. "The woman I spoke with, a Lieutenant Colonel Madison, said the visit had been cleared through the Governor's office and the State Board of Education as part of a new initiative regarding military families' educational rights. She was quite insistent." Dr. Hargrove's confident expression faltered slightly. "The Governor's office? That can't be right." "There's more, sir," Mrs. Winters continued. "Chairman Whitmore from the Board of Trustees called. Apparently, he received a call from someone at the Pentagon regarding tomorrow's visit. He's expecting your call immediately." Now Dr. Hargrove felt the first stirrings of genuine concern. The board chairman wouldn't be involved unless something significant was happening. "Very well, I'll call him right away. And Mrs. Winters, find out everything you can about Ethan Taylor's mother, her exact rank, position, whatever you can discover." In his office, Dr. Hargrove dialed Chairman Whitmore with fingers that weren't quite steady. "Lawrence," the chairman's voice was unusually formal, "would you care to explain why I received a call from the Special Assistant to the Secretary of Defense regarding Westridge Academy this morning?" "I'm as confused as you are, sir," Dr. Hargrove replied, struggling to maintain his composure. "Apparently, it relates to a routine disciplinary matter involving a scholarship student. Nothing that warranted outside involvement." "That's not how it was characterized to me," Chairman Whitmore replied coolly. "I was informed that Westridge is being included in a high-profile assessment of educational equity for military families, prompted by a case that potentially demonstrates discriminatory practices. The delegation arriving tomorrow includes several high-ranking officers and an education policy advisor to the President." Dr. Hargrove felt the blood drain from his face. "Sir, there must be some mistake. The student in question, Ethan Taylor, was suspended for intervening in an altercation. It was a straightforward disciplinary decision." "Was Senator Preston's son involved?" Chairman Whitmore asked sharply. "Well, yes, but—" "And did Preston's son receive equal consequences?" Dr. Hargrove faltered. "The circumstances were different, sir. The Preston family has a long history with Westridge, and James's actions were less severe than— Lawrence, Chairman Whitmore interrupted, his voice hardening. Do you have any idea who Sarah Taylor is? She's in the military. Some sort of officer, I believe, Dr. Hargrove replied, increasingly uncomfortable. Colonel Sarah Taylor is the Deputy Director of Strategic Operations at Central Command, Chairman Whitmore said slowly. She's one of the highest-ranking women in the— Ormian has the ear of the Joint Chiefs. She's currently leading a multinational security initiative that has been featured in national news, and she happens to serve on the President's Military Family Education Commission. The chairman's words fell like stones in the suddenly silent office. I had no idea, Dr. Hargrove stammered. Clearly, Chairman Whitmore replied dryly. And now, thanks to your handling of this situation, Westridge Academy is going to be the centerpiece of a federal review of disciplinary practices affecting military dependents in private educational institutions. The delegation arriving tomorrow will include General Hayes, the chairman of the Military Family Education Commission, along with Colonel Taylor herself, who is apparently returning from deployment specifically to address this matter. Dr. Hargrove sank into his chair. What should I do? Fix this, Lawrence, Chairman Whitmore said firmly, before tomorrow morning. Because if those helicopters land on our athletic field and this becomes a media spectacle, your position as headmaster will be the least of our concerns. As the call ended, Mrs. Winters entered with a tablet in hand, her expression grim. Sir, I've found some information about Colonel Sarah Taylor. She placed the tablet on his desk, displaying a Department of Defense press release with a photograph of a distinguished-looking woman in full military dress uniform, adorned with numerous medals and commendations. The caption identified her as Colonel Sarah Taylor, recently appointed to the President's Military Family Education Commission and recipient of the Distinguished Service Medal for her leadership in Operation Eastern Shield. There's more, sir, Mrs. Winters continued, scrolling to another article. She has a master's degree from Georgetown and a PhD in international security studies from Harvard. Before her current position, she served as a strategic advisor to NATO and led the Army's Educational Equity Task Force. Dr. Hargrove stared at the image, the magnitude of his miscalculation becoming painfully clear. This was not some low-ranking officer he could dismiss. This was someone with power, connections, and apparently the motivation to use both. And, sir, Mrs. Winters added hesitantly, the Taylor family has just been informed that their suspension appeal has been expedited for review by the state's Department of Education with a special dispensation from the governor's office. Doctor, Hargrove looked up sharply. That's impossible. Those appeals take months to process. Not in this case, apparently, Mrs. Winters replied. The email came directly from the Education Commissioner's office. For several long moments, Dr. Hargrove sat in stunned silence, the grandfather clocks ticking, suddenly deafening in the quiet office. The carefully constructed world over which he had presided was suddenly tilting on its axis, all because he had dismissed a farmer's son without considering who his mother might be. Get Jack Taylor on the phone, he finally said, his voice not entirely steady, and clear my schedule for the afternoon. I need to speak with Senator Preston as well. As Mrs. Winters left to make the calls, Dr. Hargrove stared at Colonel Taylor's image on the tablet. You're just a farmer's wife, he had thought dismissively. He could not have been more catastrophically wrong. The wheels were already in motion, and tomorrow morning military helicopters would land at Westridge Academy. Dr. Hargrove had less than 24 hours to prevent what could become the most spectacular downfall in the school's distinguished history and his own career. Jack Taylor's pickup truck rumbled down the long gravel driveway leading to their farmhouse. Beside him, Ethan stared out the window, his expression thoughtful rather than defeated. The 60-acre Taylor farm spread out around them. Golden fields, now harvested for the season, the red barn standing sturdy against the autumn sky, and the modest two-story farmhouse that had been in the family for generations. "You're awfully quiet," Jack observed as he parked beside the weathered porch steps. Ethan gathered his backpack and the small duffel containing essentials from his dormitory room, just thinking about what happens next. Inside the house, sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, illuminating a space that was nothing like Dr. Hargrove's ornate office. Here, the wooden table showed marks of family dinners, homework sessions, and Jack's occasional carpentry projects. The refrigerator displayed Ethan's academic certificates alongside his mother's military commendations. A hand-stitched sampler hung on the wall with words that had guided the Taylor family for generations. "Character is how you treat those who can do nothing for you." "Hungry?" Jack asked, opening the refrigerator. "I could make sandwiches." "Not really," Ethan replied, setting his bags down. "But I should probably eat something." As Jack assembled turkey sandwiches on homemade bread, Ethan moved to the large cork bulletin board that dominated one wall of the kitchen. Among the farm receipts, calendar notations, and photographs was a recent family picture. Ethan flanked by his parents, all smiling broadly on the day he received his Westridge scholarship notification. "She was so proud," Ethan said quietly, touching the photo. "First Taylor to ever attend a prestigious school." Jack placed the sandwiches on the table. "And she still is proud, son. This suspension doesn't change that." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Ethan spoke again. "Dad, what did Mum mean when she said she's going to Westridge tomorrow? She can't just show up and expect Dr. Hargrove to change his mind." A smile played at the corner of Jack's mouth. "Your mother has never been just anything in her life. And in the 20 years I've known her, I've learned one important lesson: never underestimate Sarah Taylor." "But what can she actually do? Hargrove made it pretty clear that my suspension is just the first step toward expulsion." Jack considered his words carefully. "Let's just say your mother understands institutions and power dynamics better than most. She spent her career navigating systems designed to keep people like us on the outside." Ethan's phone buzzed with an incoming text. He glanced at it, and his eyebrows rose in surprise. "It's from Max Chen, the guy I helped yesterday. He says there's something happening at school. Students are organizing some kind of protest against my suspension." "Really?" Jack leaned forward with interest. "Yeah, apparently James Preston's version of events isn't holding up. Too many witnesses." Ethan scrolled through more messages. "Several students have gone to their parents, and some of the parents are contacting the Board of Trustees." Jack's weathered face broke into a genuine smile. "See, truth has a way of coming out, even in places like Westridge." Ethan seemed heartened by this news, but his expression remained thoughtful. "Still doesn't change the fact that Dr. Hargrove has already made up his mind about me, about us." "People like Hargrove," Jack said, rising to clear their plates. "They see the world through a very narrow lens. Your mom calls it artificial scarcity thinking, the belief that for some to succeed, others must fail. That excellence is only valuable if it's exclusive." "And you? What do you call it?" Ethan asked. Jack chuckled. "I call it horse manure. Real excellence doesn't need to put others down to lift itself up." This drew a genuine laugh from Ethan, perhaps his first since the incident. "Don't let Mom hear you simplifying her sociological theories like that. Your mother's brilliant academic mind is matched only by my farmer's practical wisdom," Jack replied with mock seriousness. "That's why we make such a good team." The lighter moment was interrupted by Jack's phone ringing. He glanced at the caller ID with surprise. "It's Westridge Academy." Father and son exchanged puzzled looks before Jack answered, putting the call on speaker. "Jack Taylor speaking." Mr. Taylor, this is Mrs. Winters, Dr. Hargrove's assistant," came the crisp, professional voice. "Dr. Hargrove would like to schedule another meeting with you and Ethan tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. to revisit the disciplinary decision." Jack raised his eyebrows at Ethan. "That's interesting, Mrs. Winters. May I ask what prompted this reconsideration?" There was a slight pause before she answered, her tone carefully neutral. "New information has come to light regarding the incident. Dr. Hargrove feels it would be prudent to review all aspects of the case before finalizing any decisions." "I see," Jack replied, maintaining his composure despite his surprise. "And would this meeting preclude the one my wife has apparently scheduled for tomorrow?" Another pause, longer this time. "We understand Colonel Taylor will be arriving tomorrow. Dr. Hargrove hoped to address the situation prior to her visit." Ethan's eyes widened at the mention of his mother's rank, and Jack had to suppress a smile. "I'll need to consult with my wife before confirming, Mrs. Winters. May I call you back within the hour?" "Of course, Mr. Taylor. Thank you for your consideration." The line went dead. "Dad," Ethan said slowly, "what just happened?" Jack set his phone down with deliberate care. "What just happened is that your mother has already set things in motion from halfway around the world." "But how?" "She only found out about this last night. Your mom didn't get to where she is by moving slowly when something matters." Jack picked up his phone again. "Let's call her and find out exactly what she's planning." Within minutes, they were connected to Sarah via secure video call. Despite the time difference, it was middle of the night wherever she was stationed. Colonel Taylor appeared alert and focused in her combat uniform, her blonde hair pulled back in its customary bun. "They called already?" She smiled, unsurprised. "That was faster than I expected." "Sarah, what exactly did you do?" Jack asked, both amused and slightly concerned. "I simply made a few calls to ensure that Ethan's case receives appropriate attention," she replied, with practiced innocence that fooled neither her husband nor her son. "Mom," Ethan pressed, "Mrs. Winters mentioned your visit tomorrow, but you said you weren't arriving until the day after tomorrow." "Plans change, sweetheart," Sarah replied. "When certain generals heard about what happened, they felt it aligned perfectly with the military family education initiative we've been developing. Apparently, we needed a case study for the program launch." Jack leaned closer to the screen. "Sarah, are you using our son's suspension as a test case for a military education policy initiative?" "Not using," she corrected firmly. "Highlighting. Ethan's situation perfectly demonstrates why these protections are necessary. Children of military personnel face unique challenges in educational settings, particularly when one parent is deployed and the other is perceived as outside the traditional power structure." "But that's not why Dr. Hargrove suspended me," Ethan pointed out. "He suspended me because I stood up to a senator's son." "Exactly," Sarah nodded, "and that intersection of privilege, power, and prejudice is precisely what our initiative addresses. The fact that you're on an academic scholarship, live on a farm, and have a deployed mother in military service creates a perfect scenario for examining institutional bias." Jack and Ethan exchanged glances, both recognizing the strategic mind at work. "So what happens tomorrow?" Jack asked. Sarah's expression became more serious. "Tomorrow, Dr. Hargrove learns that actions have consequences beyond his insulated world. But more importantly, Westridge Academy has an opportunity to become part of the solution rather than an example of the problem." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked. "Every institution has a choice when confronted with its own failures," Sarah explained. "They can double down and defend the status quo, or they can recognize an opportunity to evolve into something better. My hope is that Westridge chooses the latter." She outlined her plan with military precision, explaining how various officials and education policy experts would be accompanying her to Westridge the following morning. The visit would highlight the need for equitable disciplinary practices, particularly for children from military families and scholarship recipients who might lack the social connections that often insulated more privileged students. Now, she concluded, it's entirely possible Dr. Hargrove will attempt to defuse the situation before we arrive. If he offers to rescind the suspension, you need to decide if that's enough. Ethan considered this carefully. It's not just about me, is it? It's about the next scholarship student who doesn't have a mother who can call in military helicopters. Sarah's face softened with visible pride. That's my boy, always seeing the bigger picture. So what should we do about this meeting he's requesting? Jack asked. Go, Sarah said firmly. Listen to what he has to say, but make no commitments. Without consulting me. This isn't just about getting your suspension lifted, Ethan. It's about creating lasting change. After finishing the call with detailed plans for the following day, Jack found Ethan sitting on the front porch, gazing out at the darkening farm fields. Penny for your thoughts? Jack asked, settling into the rocking chair beside his son. I'm just trying to process everything, Ethan replied. Yesterday I was just a student who stepped in to help someone. Today, I'm apparently a case study in institutional bias and military family educational rights. Jack chuckled softly. Welcome to life with your mother. She has a gift for transforming individual challenges into systemic solutions. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky. The distant lowing of cattle and chorus of crickets created a peaceful soundtrack so different from the manicured quiet of Westridge Academy. Dad, Ethan said finally, do you ever feel like you don't belong in Mum's world with all the high-ranking officials and policy initiatives? Jack considered the question thoughtfully. Sometimes. But then I remember something your grandfather told me when I first started dating your mother. He said, Jack, there are many kinds of strength in this world. Sarah has hers and you have yours. Together you're unbeatable. He gestured toward the fields surrounding them. This farm, this land, it's taught me patience, persistence, and the value of tangible work. Your mother's career has taught. Her strategy, leadership, and how to navigate complex systems. We bring different strengths to your life, Ethan, and you're developing your own. What if I don't know what my strengths are yet? Ethan asked quietly. You stood between a bully and his target without hesitation, Jack replied. That tells me you've already found one of your greatest strengths, moral courage. That's something no school can teach and no disciplinary committee can take away. The following morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect October day. Jack and Ethan dressed carefully for their 9 a.m. meeting with Dr. Hargrove. Jack in his best button-down shirt and least-worn jeans, Ethan in neat khakis and a collared shirt. They arrived at Westridge Academy to find an atmosphere markedly different from the day before. Security personnel were positioned at the entrance gates, checking IDs with unusual thoroughness. Staff members moved with a peculiar urgency, and as Jack parked the pickup truck, he noticed several news vans stationed discreetly across the street from the main entrance. Looks like word got out, he observed quietly as they walked toward the administration building. Inside, the normally sedate reception area hummed with tense energy. Administrators conferred in hushed tones, occasionally glancing at their watches or phones. Mrs. Winters, typically the picture of composed efficiency, greeted them with visible relief. Mr. Taylor, Ethan, thank you for coming. Dr. Hargrove is ready for you now. She ushered them directly to the headmaster's office without the customary wait. Dr. Hargrove rose as they entered, a courtesy he hadn't extended yesterday. His smile seemed forced, his complexion slightly pale beneath his usual tan. Mr. Taylor, Ethan, thank you for agreeing to meet again on such short notice. Jack nodded politely, but said nothing as they took their seats. The power dynamics in the room had shifted palpably since yesterday's meeting. "I've been reviewing the incident reports," Dr. Hargrove began, shuffling papers on his desk with unusual awkwardness. "And after careful consideration of all witness statements and contextual factors, I believe a recalibration of our disciplinary response may be warranted." Jack maintained a neutral expression. "What kind of recalibration, Dr. Hargrove?" Headmaster cleared his throat. "In light of additional testimony from students present during the incident, it appears that Ethan's intervention was indeed proportionate and potentially prevented a more serious altercation. As such, I'm prepared to rescind the suspension immediately and remove any mention of disciplinary action from his record." Ethan glanced at his father, remembering his mother's words from the night before. This wasn't just about getting his suspension lifted. "That's a significant change from yesterday's assessment," Jack observed calmly. "May I ask what prompted this reconsideration?" A muscle twitched in Dr. Hargrove's jaw. "As educators, we must always be willing to reassess our decisions when new information comes to light. The welfare and fair treatment of all Westridge students is our highest priority." Jack nodded thoughtfully. "And what about James Preston? Has his punishment been recalibrated as well?" Dr. Hargrove shifted uncomfortably. "James will face appropriate consequences, commensurate with his actions. A week of detention and a formal apology to Max Chen." "I see," Jack replied. "And will there be any changes to how Westridge handles disciplinary matters going forward? Any new protocols to ensure that family connections don't influence outcomes?" The headmaster's discomfort visibly increased. "Mr. Taylor, I assure you that Westridge has always prided itself on fair and equitable treatment of all students, regardless of background." "With all due respect, Dr. Hargrove," Jack said quietly, "your words yesterday suggested otherwise. You explicitly cited the Preston family's legacy status and contributions to this institution as factors in your disciplinary decision." "Doctor." Hargrove's face flushed slightly. "Perhaps my phrasing was unfortunate. What I intended to convey—" He was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Mrs. Winters entered, her expression tense. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Dr. Hargrove, but Chairman Whitmore has arrived with several board members. They're requesting to join this meeting immediately." Before the headmaster could respond, the door opened wider to admit a distinguished older man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, followed by three equally imposing individuals in business attire. "Lawrence," the silver-haired man said briskly. "We felt it imperative to participate in this discussion, given the circumstances." He turned to Jack and Ethan with a cordial nod. "Mr. Taylor, Ethan, I'm William Whitmore, Chairman of the Westridge Board of Trustees. These are my colleagues." From the board's Ethics and Governance Committee, Dr. Hargrove's complexion had gone from slightly pale to ashen. "Of course, Chairman. We were just discussing the resolution of yesterday's disciplinary action." Chairman Whitmore took a seat, his colleagues arranging themselves around the office. "Excellent. And have you shared our new disciplinary oversight protocols with the Taylors yet?" "I was just getting to that," Dr. Hargrove replied weakly. "Allow me then," Chairman Whitmore said, turning to Jack and Ethan. "In light of recent events, the board has implemented immediate changes to Westridge's disciplinary procedures. All suspensions and potential expulsions will now require review by a committee that includes faculty, administrative staff, student representatives, and a board member. This ensures that no single individual's perspective or biases determines a student's educational future." Jack nodded appreciatively. "That sounds like a positive step toward fairness." "Additionally," Whitmore continued, "we're implementing blind review protocols for the initial phase of all disciplinary proceedings. Student names, family backgrounds, and financial status will be redacted until after preliminary recommendations are made. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Does that include whether someone is a scholarship student? Chairman Whitmore smiled slightly. Especially that, young man. Merit should be the measure of a student's place at Westridge, not financial means or family connections. He turned toward Dr. Hargrove with a pointed look. Isn't that right, Lawrence? Absolutely, the headmaster agreed hastily. Westridge has always valued academic excellence and character above all else. Indeed, Whitmore replied dryly, though our application of those values may have occasionally fallen short of our aspirations. Just then, Mrs. Winters reappeared. At the door, her expression now one of barely contained alarm. Dr. Hargrove, Chairman Whitmore, they're here. A distant sound became suddenly apparent, the rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors approaching. Chairman Whitmore checked his watch. Right on schedule. Dr. Hargrove rose from his desk, perspiration visible on his forehead. Perhaps we should continue this discussion after... Actually, Whitmore interrupted smoothly, I believe this is precisely the right moment to conclude our discussion with the Taylors. He turned to Jack and Ethan. Unless you have any questions, before we proceed to the next phase of today's activities, Jack exchanged a glance with his son, then addressed Chairman Whitmore directly. Just one. These changes you've outlined, will they be temporary measures or permanent policy revisions? Excellent question, Whitmore replied with approval. The board voted unanimously this morning to incorporate these changes into Westridge's official governance documents, effective immediately and binding on all future administrations. He reached into his suit jacket and withdrew an official-looking document. This is the board resolution, which will be published in today's school bulletin and announced at a special assembly this afternoon. We've also prepared a press release for the media representatives who have, somewhat mysteriously, gathered outside our gates this morning. His pointed glance at Dr. Hargrove made it clear that the chairman had a good idea of how the media had learned of today's events. The helicopter sounds grew louder, and Mrs. Winters gestured urgently from the doorway. They're landing on the East Field, as requested. Chairman Whitmore stood. Shall we welcome our distinguished visitors, Dr. Hargrove? I believe Colonel Taylor is eager to discuss Westridge's participation in the Military Family Education Initiative. Dr. Hargrove straightened his tie with shaking fingers. Of course, Chairman. As they moved toward the door, Whitmore paused, beside Ethan. Young man, I've reviewed your academic record and the actual accounts of yesterday's incident. Westridge Academy is fortunate to have a student of your character. Your actions demonstrated exactly the kind of moral leadership we aspire to instill in all our students. Ethan nodded respectfully. Thank you, sir. Now, Whitmore continued with a slight smile, I believe your mother has arrived with quite an entourage. Shall we go greet her? They exited the administration building to find the campus in controlled chaos. Students pressed against classroom windows or gathered in small groups on the quad, pointing toward the East Field, where 3 military helicopters had touched down with precision. Security personnel created a perimeter as uniformed officers and civilians in formal attire disembarked. Dr. Hargrove's pace slowed noticeably as they approached the field, his earlier confidence entirely evaporated. Beside him, Chairman Whitmore moved with purpose, clearly prepared for whatever was about to unfold. From the center, helicopter emerged a striking figure that caused Ethan to break into a broad smile. Colonel Sarah Taylor, in full-dress uniform adorned with medals and insignia that reflected her distinguished service, surveyed the campus with the calm assessment of a strategic commander. Behind her came a collection of high-ranking officers and civilians carrying briefcases emblazoned with government seals. As they approached, Jack whispered to Ethan, "Now you see why I never win arguments with your mother." Ethan suppressed A laugh, watching as his mother, transformed from the warm, funny woman he knew at home into this commanding military presence, led her delegation across the field with measured steps. Chairman Whitmore was the first to step forward. "Colonel Taylor, welcome to Westridge Academy. I'm William Whitmore, Chairman of the Board of Trustees." Sarah shook his hand firmly. "Chairman Whitmore, thank you for accommodating our visit on such short notice. As I mentioned in our call yesterday, Westridge presents an ideal case study for our initiative." Her gaze moved past him to Dr. Hargrove, who seemed to shrink slightly under her direct assessment. "Dr. Hargrove, I presume. I understand you've been discussing my son's situation this morning?" "Yes, Colonel," he replied, his voice steadier than might have been expected. "We've rescinded Ethan's suspension and implemented new protocols to ensure fair disciplinary practices for all students." "I'm pleased to hear it," Sarah replied evenly, "though I'm curious why it required the intervention of the Department of Defense, the Governor's office, and 3 military helicopters to achieve such a reasonable outcome." Before Dr. Hargrove could formulate a response, Chairman Whitmore interjected smoothly. "Colonel Taylor, on behalf of the Westridge Board, I want to assure you that the oversights in this case have prompted significant policy revisions that will benefit all students, particularly those from military families and scholarship recipients." Sarah nodded appreciatively. "That's precisely the kind of institutional response we're highlighting in our initiative, Chairman Whitmore. Not just correcting individual instances of inequity, but implementing systemic changes to prevent future occurrences." She gestured to a distinguished man in uniform with general's stars on his shoulders. General Hayes, chairman of the Military Family Education Commission, would be happy to discuss how Westridge might participate in our pilot program for educational equity standards. As the officials began a detailed discussion, Sarah stepped away to greet her family. Her official demeanor softened as she embraced Ethan, then Jack. "Mom, this is—" Ethan gestured to the helicopters, the delegation, the media gathering at the campus perimeter. "This is incredible." Sarah smiled, the strategic commander momentarily replaced by the proud mother. "What's incredible is you, Ethan. Standing up for what's right, even when it would have been easier to look the other way." "I just did what you and Dad taught me," he replied simply. She squeezed his shoulder. "And that's why all of this matters. Because every child deserves the chance to act with integrity without fear that their background or circumstances will be used against them." Looking past her son to the gathering of officials, media, and now curious students, Sarah's expression became thoughtful. "What happened to you was wrong, Ethan. But sometimes it takes something wrong to create an opportunity for something right. Westridge Academy will be a better institution after today, not just for you, but for every student who walks through those gates in the future." As they spoke, Dr. Hargrove was visibly wilting under General Hayes's questioning about Westridge's support systems for military dependents. Chairman Whitmore, meanwhile, was already discussing implementation details for new equity protocols with education policy experts from Sarah's delegation. "So what happens now?" Jack asked, watching the scene unfold. Sarah checked her watch. "Now, we formalize Westridge's participation in the Military Family Education Initiative. The school receives federal grants to implement enhanced support services for military dependents and scholarship students, plus recognition as a pioneer in educational equity practices." "And Dr. Hargrove?" Ethan asked quietly. A small smile played at the corner of Sarah's mouth. "Let's just say Dr. Hargrove is about to receive an intensive education in leadership, accountability, and the consequences of underestimating people based on their backgrounds." As if on cue, a photographer from one of the news crews captured an image that would appear in newspapers across the country the following day. A farmer, a colonel, and their son standing together on the pristine grounds of one of the nation's most exclusive prep schools, living proof that excellence wears many faces and true leadership recognizes potential in all its forms. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Westridge Academy's East Field as military and school officials continued their discussions. Students pressed against classroom windows, smartphones recording the unprecedented scene unfolding on their campus. The 3 military helicopters remained on the field, powerful symbols of an authority far beyond the headmaster's mahogany-paneled office. In the center of this extraordinary tableau stood the Taylor family, Jack in his clean but well-worn clothes, Colonel Sarah Taylor in her decorated uniform, and Ethan, who just 24 hours earlier had been escorted from campus in disgrace. Now he stood tall, witnessing the swift recalibration of power that his mother's arrival had triggered. Chairman Whitmore approached the family, his expression one of professional cordiality with hints of genuine respect. Colonel Taylor, our board is unanimously enthusiastic about participating in the Military Family Education Initiative. We see this as an opportunity not just to correct an unfortunate incident, but to make Westridge a model for educational equity. Sarah nodded appreciatively. I'm pleased to hear that, Chairman. True leadership is demonstrated by how we respond to our mistakes, not by pretending we never make them. Her gaze drifted meaningfully toward Dr. Hargrove, who stood some distance away in conversation with General Hayes. The headmaster's usual confident posture had disappeared, replaced by the deferential body language of someone suddenly aware of his precarious position. If you don't mind, Chairman Whitmore continued, we'd like to convene a special assembly this afternoon to announce these new initiatives to the student body. Your presence would add significant weight to the message. Of course, Sarah agreed, though I believe Ethan should address his fellow students as well. After all, his courage is what catalyzed these changes. Ethan looked startled. Me? Speak at an assembly? Who better? His mother replied with confidence. You demonstrated moral leadership when it mattered most. That's a perspective worth sharing. As the chairman moved away to make arrangements, Ethan turned to his parents with visible apprehension. What would I even say? Jack placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. The truth, son. About standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. About how systems can change when brave people challenge them. Exactly, Sarah agreed. Remember what we've always taught you. Courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what's right despite your fear. A short distance away, Max Chen, the student Ethan had defended in the dining hall, approached hesitantly, accompanied by several classmates. They paused respectfully before Colonel Taylor. Excuse me, ma'am, Max said politely. We just wanted to thank you for coming, and to tell Ethan that a lot of us have been speaking up about what really happened. Sarah smiled warmly. That's how change happens, young man, when people with integrity refuse to remain silent. One of the other students, a girl with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, stepped forward. I'm Sophia Rivera, Student Council Vice President. We've drafted a petition calling for a student representative on the disciplinary committee. Over half the student body has already signed it. Ethan looked genuinely surprised. Really? That many students care about this? More than you know, Sophia replied earnestly. What happened to you made a lot of us realize how arbitrary the system can be, and not just for scholarship students, for anyone who doesn't have powerful connections. Or the right zip code, added another student, his British accent marking him as one of the international students. Sarah exchanged a meaningful glance with Jack. This was precisely the kind of systemic awareness they had raised Ethan to recognize. How individual injustices often reflected deeper institutional biases. I'd be happy to review your petition, Sarah told the students. In fact, I believe Chairman Whitmore would be very interested to see it as well. As the students moved away, energized by this encouragement, Ethan watched them with newfound perspective. "I never realized how many allies I had here," he said quietly. "I thought I was alone." "That's often how it feels when you're standing up for what's right," Jack replied. "But integrity creates its own community, son. People recognize it, even if they don't always have the courage to stand with you immediately." The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Winters, who approached with considerably more deference than she had shown the Taylors the previous day. "Colonel Taylor, the assembly has been scheduled for 3 p.m. in the main auditorium. Chairman Whitmore asked if you would like a private space to prepare your remarks." "Thank you, Mrs. Winters," Sarah replied with professional courtesy, "though I believe my son is the one who could use a quiet space to collect his thoughts." As Mrs. Winters led Ethan toward the administration building, he glanced back at his parents with a mixture of nervousness and determination. Jack gave him an encouraging thumbs up, while Sarah nodded confidently. Their son was about to take his first steps as a leader in his own right, not because of their influence, but because of his own innate integrity. Once Ethan was out of earshot, Jack turned to his wife with a mixture of admiration and amusement. "Military helicopter, Sarah? Don't you think that might have been a touch dramatic?" Sarah's composed expression cracked slightly as she suppressed a smile. "The helicopters were General Hayes's idea, actually. When I explained the situation, he pointed out that a visual demonstration of authority would expedite the negotiations. Besides," she added with a gleam in her eye, "sometimes you need to speak the language of power to those who only respect power." Jack chuckled softly. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." 20 years too late for that warning, farm boy," she replied affectionately, briefly taking his calloused hand in hers. "But you're too wise to make the mistake Hargrove did, underestimating someone based on appearances." Their moment was interrupted by Dr. Hargrove himself, approaching with the stiff formality of someone performing an unpleasant duty. "Colonel Taylor, I want to personally apologize for the mishandling of your son's disciplinary case. It was a regrettable error in judgment on my part." Sarah regarded him with professional detachment. "Dr. Hargrove, I appreciate your apology, but I'm not the one who was wronged." Ethan deserves to hear those words directly. The headmaster's discomfort visibly increased. "Yes, of course. I intend to address that during the assembly." "A public acknowledgement is appropriate," Sarah agreed, "but personal accountability requires direct conversation. I'm sure an educator of your experience understands the difference between performative apologies and genuine reconciliation." Dr. Hargrove nodded stiffly. "I'll speak with Ethan privately before the assembly." "Excellent," Sarah replied, her tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion, but an expectation. "I believe you'll find my son remarkably gracious, despite the circumstances. His character has been shaped by values that recognize the humanity in everyone, even those who have treated him unfairly." As Dr. Hargrove retreated, Jack shook his head slightly. "I think you enjoyed that a little too much." "Perhaps," Sarah admitted, "but sometimes people like Hargrove need to experience the discomfort they've caused others before they truly understand the impact of their actions." Together, they watched as preparations continued across campus. Staff members hurried to and from the auditorium. Students gathered in excited clusters discussing the day's extraordinary events, and media representatives positioned themselves strategically by the main entrance. What had begun as a simple case of standing up to a bully had transformed into something much larger, a moment of institutional reckoning. "Do you think anything will really change?" Jack asked quietly. "Once the helicopters leave and the media moves on to the next story?" Sarah considered the question thoughtfully. "Some things already have changed, Jack. The board's new disciplinary protocols, the student petition, the participation in our education initiative. Those aren't symbolic gestures. They're structural reforms that will outlast today's drama. She glanced toward the administration building where Ethan was preparing his remarks. But the most important change isn't in the policies or procedures. It's in those students who witness someone stand up for what's right and face consequences with dignity. It's in those who found their own voice through this process. That's the change that matters most, the one that ripples outward long after. The immediate crisis passes. At precisely 3:00 p.m., Westridge Academy's grand auditorium was filled to capacity. Students sat in neat rows, faculty members lined the walls, and a selection of parents who had arrived after hearing about the day's events occupied the rear seating section. At the front, a podium bearing the Westridge seal stood flanked by the American flag and the school's own banner. Chairman Whitmore opened the proceedings with a brief explanation of the day's events and the changes being implemented. His direct acknowledgement of the school's failure in Ethan's case drew murmurs from the assembled students, many of whom had never before heard a Westridge authority figure admit to an institutional mistake. Leadership, Whitmore concluded, requires the humility to recognize our errors and the courage to correct them. Today marks not an embarrassment for Westridge Academy, but an opportunity for growth and recommitment to our true values of excellence, integrity, and fairness. He then introduced Dr. Hargrove, whose normally confident stride seemed hesitant as he approached the podium. The headmaster adjusted his tie and surveyed the assembled students, many of whom regarded him with newly critical eyes. "Students, faculty, honored guests," he began, his voice slightly strained. "For 12 years, I have had the privilege of leading this distinguished institution. In that time, I have prided myself on upholding Westridge's traditions of excellence and disciplined character development." He paused, visibly struggling with what came next. "Yesterday, I failed to live up to those standards. In my handling of a disciplinary matter involving Ethan Taylor, I allowed considerations beyond the facts of the case to influence my judgment. I permitted the prestige of one family to outweigh the principled actions of another student." Ripple of whispers spread through the auditorium as students processed this unprecedented admission. "This was not merely a procedural error," Dr. Hargrove continued, "but a moral one. It contradicted the very values Westridge claims to instill in our students: courage, integrity, and justice. For this, I offer my sincere apology to Ethan Taylor and to the entire Westridge community." The headmaster's gaze found Ethan, seated in the front row between his parents. "Mr. Taylor, your actions in defending a fellow student demonstrated the character and moral courage that we should celebrate, not punish. I failed to recognize that, and for that, I am truly sorry." With those words, Dr. Hargrove stepped away from the podium, yielding to Chairman Whitmore, who next introduced Colonel Sarah Taylor. As she rose and approached the stage in her full dress uniform, an appreciative murmur swept through the audience. Many students had never seen a high-ranking female military officer in person, and Sarah's commanding presence immediately captured their attention. "Thank you, Chairman Whitmore, Dr. Hargrove, distinguished faculty and students," she began, her voice clear and resonant in the large space. "I stand before you today, not primarily as a colonel, but as a parent, one who, like all parents, wants their child to receive fair treatment and the opportunity to learn in an environment that recognizes their worth." Sarah surveyed the young faces before her, her expression thoughtful. "Many of you may be wondering why the military would involve itself in what appears to be a routine school disciplinary matter. The answer lies in a fundamental principle that guides both educational institutions and military organizations. Justice must not only be fair, but be perceived as fair by all stakeholders." She gestured toward the back of the auditorium where members of her delegation sat observing. The Military Family Education Initiative, which Westridge has agreed to join as a pilot institution, was created precisely because children of military personnel face unique challenges in educational settings. When a parent is deployed overseas, serving our country, these students need assurance that they will be treated with the same fairness and consideration as their peers from more traditional backgrounds. Sarah's gaze swept across the auditorium. But this initiative isn't just about military families. It's about recognizing that excellence and integrity can come from any background, from a senator's mansion or from a 60-acre farm. It's about creating educational environments where who you are matters more than where you come from or whom you know. Several students nodded in agreement, and Sarah noticed Sophia Rivera, the Student Council Vice President, watching with particular intensity. The changes Westridge is implementing today, student representation on disciplinary committees, blind review protocols, systematic checks against bias, these aren't concessions. They're improvements that will strengthen this institution and better prepare all of you for leadership in a diverse, complex world. She smiled slightly, her expression softening. In the military, we have a saying, the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. Yesterday, my son Ethan refused to walk past a standard of behavior that he knew was wrong. He chose to intervene when he saw a fellow student being mistreated, knowing it might cost him personally. Sarah's voice filled with quiet pride. That's the kind of moral courage we need in all our institutions, the willingness to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult, even when it comes with consequences. As she concluded her remarks and returned to her seat, the applause was immediate and enthusiastic. Sarah had struck a chord that resonated beyond the immediate circumstances, touching on universal principles of fairness and integrity that transcended the specific incident involving her son. Next came an unexpected speaker, James Preston, the senator's son, whose bullying behavior had triggered the entire situation. His appearance at the podium caused a surprised hush to fall over the audience. The normally confident young man appeared, visibly uncomfortable as he gripped the edges of the podium. I wasn't scheduled to speak today, he began hesitantly, but after hearing Dr. Hargrove and Colonel Taylor, I realized I needed to say something too. He took a deep breath. What happened in the dining hall yesterday? I was wrong. Max didn't deserve to be treated that way, and Ethan was right to step in. I got angry because he challenged me, and I used my father's position to make sure I'd face minimal consequences while Ethan took the blame. James looked directly at Ethan. I'm sorry, man. What I did wasn't just about you or Max. It was about thinking some rules didn't apply to me because of my last name. That's not the kind of person I want to be. This unexpected display of humility drew murmurs of surprise from the student body. James Preston, known for his entitlement and arrogance, had never before shown such self-awareness or contrition. My father always talks about leadership and responsibility, James continued, his voice steadier now. But yesterday, Ethan showed more of both than I did. I'm going to try to learn from that. As James returned to his seat, Chairman Whitmore nodded appreciatively. These honest acknowledgments of error from the headmaster, from James, were perhaps the most powerful educational moments these students had experienced at Westridge. And now, the chairman announced, I'd like to invite Ethan Taylor to address us. Ethan rose from his seat, straightening his shoulders as he approached. The podium. Unlike the previous speakers, he carried no notes. He simply stood for a moment, taking in the hundreds of faces turned toward him, then spoke from the heart. 24 hours ago, I thought my time at Westridge was over, he began, his voice quiet but clear. I believed that standing up for what's right had cost me my place here. In some ways, that was the easiest part, making that split-second decision to help someone in trouble. The harder part was facing the consequences afterward, wondering if I'd made the right choice. He glanced toward his parents, drawing strength from their supportive presence. "My dad has a saying posted in our barn: character is what you do when no one is watching. But yesterday taught me something important. Character is also what you maintain when everyone is watching and judging you unfairly." Ethan's gaze moved across the assembly, making brief eye contact with Max Chen, with Sofia Rivera, even with James Preston. "I didn't expect helicopters to show up," he said with a slight smile that broke the tension. "I didn't expect policy changes or special assemblies. I just did what I thought was right in the moment, the way my parents taught me." His expression grew more serious. "But what happened afterward? That's the part that matters for all of us, because it shows that systems can change. Injustice doesn't have to be permanent. Speaking up matters, even when it seems hopeless." Ethan gestured towards Sophia and the student council members. "The petition for student representation on disciplinary committees, that came from you, not from military helicopters or board interventions. The witnesses who came forward to tell what really happened, that was your courage, not my mom's rank or my dad's wisdom." He straightened slightly, his voice gaining confidence. "I'm just a scholarship student from a farm in Riverdale County. But today I learned that doesn't make my voice less important or my perspective less valuable. And the same is true for every one of you, no matter your background, your family name, or your financial circumstances." Ethan concluded with simple dignity. Westridge's motto is excellence through tradition. Maybe after today we can all understand that traditions are meant to evolve, to improve, to become more inclusive. True excellence comes not from excluding people who are different, but from embracing the diverse strengths we all bring to this community. As Ethan finished speaking, the auditorium erupted in applause. Students rose to their feet, many genuinely moved by his words. Faculty members exchanged glances, some with tears in their eyes, recognizing the profound learning moment they were witnessing. Even Dr. Hargrove, despite his obvious discomfort throughout the assembly, joined in the standing ovation. Chairman Whitmore returned to the podium for final remarks, officially announcing Westridge's participation in the Military Family Education Initiative and the immediate implementation of new disciplinary protocols. As the assembly concluded, students streamed toward Ethan, many wanting to express their support or simply shake his hand. Amid the crowd, one interaction stood out. James Preston approached Ethan with obvious hesitation, extending his hand. "I meant what I said up there," he told Ethan quietly. "I'm sorry and I'm going to do better." Ethan accepted the handshake with a nod. "That took courage," he acknowledged. "Not many people would have done that." As the crowd gradually dispersed, General Hayes approached the Taylor family. "Colonel Taylor," he said with professional respect, "the Secretary is extremely pleased with Westridge's commitment to the initiative. We'd like to feature this case study in the national rollout next month, with your permission." Sarah glanced at Ethan, giving him the choice. "What do you think, son? Are you comfortable with your story being shared more broadly?" Ethan considered this thoughtfully. "If it helps other students in similar situations, then yes. But it's not just my story. It's about everyone who spoke up, including James. I think that's important to include." General Hayes nodded appreciatively. "Well said, young man. The most powerful narratives are rarely about individuals alone, but about communities finding their collective voice." As they prepared to leave the auditorium, Chairman Whitmore approached with a request. "Colonel Taylor, would you and your family consider joining our board's education committee as consultants? Your perspectives would be invaluable as we implement these new policies." Sarah exchanged glances with Jack. "I think we might be able to arrange that, particularly since I'll be stateside for the next 6 months. Jack has considerable wisdom about character development that your students could benefit from as well." Whitmore looked genuinely pleased. Excellent. And Ethan, several faculty members have suggested creating a peer mediation program. Given what we've witnessed today, I can think of no better student to help develop it. As they finally exited the building into the late afternoon sunlight, the 3 helicopters still waited on the east field, a reminder of the extraordinary sequence of events that had transformed not just one student's experience, but an entire institution's approach to fairness and accountability. "So," Jack said quietly to his wife and son, "I guess we're not heading back to the farm just yet." Sarah smiled, her formal military bearing softening now that the official events had concluded. Sometimes standing up for what's right leads to opportunities you never anticipated. Ethan looked back at the imposing buildings of Westridge Academy, seeing them with new eyes. 24 hours ago, he had felt like an outsider in those hallowed halls. Now he understood that his perspective, shaped by farm work, by his mother's military service, by his father's quiet wisdom, brought unique value to this privileged environment. "You know what this means, don't you?" he said to his parents with a hint of mischief in his expression. "You're going to have to explain to Grandpa why those helicopters landed in the middle of a prep school campus." Jack laughed, slinging an arm around his son's shoulders. "I think your grandfather will understand perfectly. He always said the Taylor family has a knack for making memorable entrances." As they walked toward the waiting military vehicles, Ethan noticed Sofia Rivera and several other student council members watching them with obvious admiration. He realized that his actions, both in defending Max Chen and in addressing the assembly, had created a ripple effect that would continue long after today's dramatic events faded from memory. That, he reflected, was perhaps the most powerful lesson of all, that courage, once demonstrated, had a way of inspiring courage in others. Systems could change, not just through dramatic interventions from outside, but through the accumulated impact of individuals refusing to accept injustice as inevitable. The sun was beginning to set as the helicopters lifted off from Westridge Academy, carrying the Taylor family and the military delegation back to base. Below them, the campus grew smaller, its Georgian architecture and manicured grounds diminishing with distance, but the impact of what had transpired there would continue to expand, touching lives far beyond the school's wrought iron gates. Sometimes, Ethan realized, the most powerful form of leadership wasn't about having the highest rank or the most prestigious title. It was about having the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it came at a personal cost. And sometimes, the most meaningful changes began with a single act of integrity that others found the courage to emulate. As Westridge Academy disappeared from view, Ethan felt a profound sense of possibility. This wasn't an ending, but a beginning. Not just for him, but for an institution that had been challenged to live up to its highest ideals. The journey ahead would undoubtedly include setbacks and resistance, but today had proven that positive. Change was possible, even in systems that seemed immutable. That knowledge, more than helicopters or policy changes or public apologies, was what he would carry forward into whatever challenges awaited him next. 5 years had passed since the day military helicopters landed on the east field of Westridge Academy, transforming not just one student's academic journey, but reshaping the culture of one of the nation's most elite preparatory schools. On this crisp autumn morning, the campus bustled with activity for the dedication ceremony of the new Taylor Center for Educational Equity. The modern glass and brick building stood at the center of campus, its architecture deliberately designed to contrast with the traditional Georgian structures that surrounded it, a physical reminder that institutions could honor their history. While embracing necessary change, Ethan Taylor, now a senior at West Point Military Academy, stood at the edge of the crowd gathering for the ceremony. At 21, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that had once caught Dr. Hargrove's attention, though now it was paired with the disciplined bearing of a cadet in his final year. His cadet uniform, with its distinctive grey and black, stood out among the business attire and Westridge blazers surrounding him. "There he is," called a familiar voice. Max Chen approached with a broad smile, extending his hand. No longer the intimidated sophomore Ethan had defended years ago, Max had grown into a confident young man who now served as Westridge's student body president. The man of the hour. Ethan returned the handshake with a warm smile. "Hardly. This is about something much bigger than me." "True," Max acknowledged. "But it wouldn't have happened without you standing up that day. Some of us haven't forgotten that." As they spoke, Sofia Rivera joined them, elegant in a tailored suit that reflected her new role as the youngest ever student representative on Westridge's Board of Trustees. "The prodigal hero returns," she said with a smile, embracing Ethan. "Briefly, how does it feel to be back?" Ethan glanced around at the campus that had once been the site of his greatest humiliation, and ultimately his most profound lesson in leadership. "Different," he admitted, "but in all the right ways." The changes were evident everywhere he looked. What had once been an intimidatingly homogeneous student body now reflected a genuine diversity of backgrounds. The intimidating isolation he had felt as a scholarship student from a rural background had given way to a visible community of students from varied socio-economic circumstances, including a significant contingent of military dependents. The Military Family Education Initiative has 16 participating schools now, Sofia informed him, following his gaze. But Westridge remains the flagship. The case study from what happened with you is still required reading for every new administrator in the program. That's still strange to think about, Ethan admitted, that something so personal became so institutional. "That's how real change happens," came another voice, deeper and wiser with age. Jack Taylor approached, his weathered farmer's hands now supplemented by the gold band of the Westridge Board of Trustees on his right hand. The years had added silver to his temples, but his eyes still held the same quiet strength. Individual courage creates ripples that eventually reshape systems. Father and son embraced warmly. "Mom's flight just landed," Jack informed him. "She'll be here any minute." As if on cue, the distant sound of helicopter rotors became audible, drawing every eye skyward. A military helicopter appeared over the tree line, smaller than the three that had arrived that fateful day, 5 years earlier, but no less symbolic to those gathered below. "Still knows how to make an entrance," Jack chuckled, shaking his head. With fond exasperation, the helicopter touched down precisely where its predecessors had landed years before. The side door opened, and Colonel Sarah Taylor, now Brigadier General Sarah Taylor, emerged in her dress uniform, the morning sunlight glinting off her insignia. Behind her came several uniformed officers and a distinguished civilian whom Ethan recognized immediately from news coverage, the Secretary of Education. As Sarah approached her family, her official bearing softened momentarily as she embraced her son. "You made it," she said with evident pride. "I wasn't sure they'd give you leave." "My commanding officer suggested it might be educational," Ethan replied with a smile. "I think he was curious about the famous Taylor family story." The family's reunion was briefly interrupted as Chairman Whitmore approached, his hair now completely silver, but his bearing as dignified as ever. "General Taylor, Mr. Taylor, Cadet Taylor, we're honored by your presence today. The Secretary has arrived as well, I see." Sarah nodded. She was quite insistent about attending personally. The Educational Equity Initiative has become something of a signature achievement for this administration. Whitmore's gaze moved past them, and his expression shifted slightly. "And I see our other special guest has arrived as well." They turned to see Dr. Lawrence Hargrove approaching slowly. Now retired, the former headmaster moved with the slight stoop of advancing age, though his clothing remained impeccable. What had changed most noticeably was his expression, the haughty confidence replaced by a more thoughtful demeanor, his eyes reflecting the humility learned through public failure and subsequent redemption. He paused before the Taylor family, a moment of palpable tension hanging in the air. 5 years had passed, but memories remained vivid. "General Taylor, Cadet Taylor, Mr. Taylor," he greeted them formally. "Thank you for including me today. It means a great deal." Sarah nodded professionally, but it was Ethan who stepped forward, extending his hand. "Dr. Hargrove, I'm glad you could be here." The older man's relief was visible as he accepted the handshake. "The honor is mine, truly. What began as my greatest. Professional failure has become Westridge's most profound transformation. There's a certain poetry in that." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "My tactical officer at West Point says we learn more from our failures than our successes, if we have the courage to face them honestly." "Your tactical officer is wise," Dr. Hargrove agreed, a hint of his old professorial manner returning. "Though I might have preferred a less public lesson." This drew genuine laughter from the group, breaking the last of the tension between them. As Chairman Whitmore guided them toward the ceremony site, Ethan observed the former headmaster with new eyes. The man who had once dismissed him as unsuitable for Westridge had become part of the very transformation his actions had catalyzed, perhaps the most powerful testament to the possibility of institutional change. The dedication ceremony began with all the pomp and circumstance befitting Westridge's traditions. The school orchestra played as dignitaries took their seats on the stage, erected before the new building. In the front rows sat current students, faculty, board members, and special guests, including James Preston, now a law student who had founded a legal advocacy group for educational equity. Chairman Whitmore opened the proceedings with characteristic eloquence. 5 years ago, Westridge Academy faced a moment of institutional reckoning. We could have chosen to defend the status quo, to protect our traditions at the expense of our values. Instead, thanks to the courage of one student and the determination of his family, we chose a different path. He gestured toward the gleaming new building behind him. The Taylor Center for Educational Equity stands as a physical manifestation of that choice and of the ongoing commitment Westridge has made to ensuring that excellence is recognized and nurtured regardless of background, connections, or circumstances. The chairman introduced a series of speakers, each offering perspectives on the journey that had led to this moment. The Secretary of Education spoke about the national impact of the Military Family Education Initiative, which now served thousands of students across the country. Dr. Hargrove, in a moment of remarkable institutional accountability, spoke candidly about the failures of leadership that had necessitated change and the growth that had come from confronting those failures. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she approached the podium with the commanding presence that had once intimidated Dr. Hargrove into reconsidering his position. 5 years ago, I landed on this field under very different circumstances. She began, drawing appreciative chuckles from those who remembered that day. I came as a mother, determined to protect her son from injustice. I return today as a witness to what can happen when institutions embrace accountability rather than defensiveness. She surveyed the audience thoughtfully. In the military, we often speak of force multipliers, factors that dramatically increase the effectiveness of an action. What happened here at Westridge demonstrates that moral courage can be the most powerful force multiplier of all. One student standing up for what was right, regardless of personal cost, created ripples that have transformed not just this institution, but educational policies nationwide. Sarah's gaze found her son in the front row, the Taylor Center being Dedicated Today isn't named for me, despite what some might assume given my rank. It's named for the values that my husband and I have tried to instill in our son, and that he demonstrated that day in the dining hall. Values that recognize true leadership comes not from authority or position, but from the courage to stand up for what's right, especially when it's difficult. As Sarah concluded her remarks, Chairman Whitmore returned to the podium to introduce the final speaker. 5 years ago, a 16-year-old scholarship student stood in our assembly hall and spoke with remarkable wisdom about the true meaning of character and institutional integrity. Today, that young man returns to us as a senior cadet at West Point, where he continues to demonstrate the leadership qualities that have become central to Westridge's mission. Ladies and gentlemen, Cadet Ethan Taylor. The applause was enthusiastic. As Ethan approached the podium, his military bearing evident in his measured stride and straight posture, he took a moment to survey the gathered audience, his gaze lingering briefly on his parents before addressing the assembly. "The last time I spoke at Westridge Academy," he began with a slight smile, "I was wearing a hastily straightened uniform tie and trying not to show how terrified I felt. Today isn't much different, except for the uniform." This drew appreciative laughter, immediately establishing a connection with his audience. What happened 5 years ago has been described in many ways, as a controversy, as a catalyst for change, as a case study in educational equity. For me, it was simply a moment when I had to decide what kind of person I wanted to be. Ethan's expression grew thoughtful. "At West Point, we study leadership extensively, its theories, its applications, its historical examples. But what I've learned most profoundly, both there and here at Westridge, is that leadership begins with a willingness to stand alone when necessary, to do what's right even when it's unpopular or comes at personal cost." He gestured toward the new building behind him. "The Taylor Center represents something far more important than my family's name or my small part in Westridge's journey. It represents the recognition that institutions are not static monuments to tradition, but living communities that must constantly examine whether they're truly living their highest values." Ethan's gaze moved across the audience, making brief eye contact with Max, with Sophia, with James Preston, and finally with Dr. Hargrove. 5 years ago, I stood in this community feeling isolated and judged. Today, I see a transformed institution where diversity of background is recognized as a strength, not a liability. I see administrators and faculty committed to equitable practices and students empowered to advocate for justice. Most importantly, I see an educational community that had the courage to learn from its mistakes and grow stronger through self-examination. He paused, his expression reflecting the journey from that confrontational meeting in Dr. Hargrove's office to this moment of institutional celebration. The lesson I hope every student at Westridge takes from this story isn't about helicopters, or high-ranking parents, or dramatic confrontations. It's about a simple truth that my father taught me growing up on our farm. Real strength isn't about power or position. It's about having the courage to stand up for what's right, especially when you stand alone. As Ethan concluded his remarks, the audience rose in a standing ovation. The applause continued as Chairman Whitmore returned to the podium for the formal ribbon-cutting ceremony, inviting the Taylor family, Dr. Hargrove, and the Secretary of Education to join him. Together, they cut the ceremonial ribbon, officially opening the Taylor Center for Educational Equity, a physical testament to how one act of moral courage had transformed an institution. As the formal ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse for the reception, Ethan found himself approached by a young woman in a Westridge uniform, her expression nervous but determined. "Cadet Taylor, I'm Maya Wilson. I'm a sophomore. Here on the Rural Scholarship Program, the one they created after what happened with you. Ethan smiled warmly, immediately putting her at ease. It's good to meet you, Maya. How are you finding Westridge? It was intimidating at first, she admitted. I'm from a small farming community in Iowa, but the support programs at the Taylor Center made all the difference. She hesitated briefly before continuing. Actually, I'm working on establishing a mentoring program for new scholarship students. We'd love your input if you have time before you leave. I'd be honored, Ethan replied sincerely. As Maya explained her initiative, Ethan was struck by how naturally she spoke of advocacy and institutional improvement, concepts that would have seemed impossibly daunting to him as a sophomore. What had once required military helicopters and governmental intervention had become part of the everyday conversation at Westridge, with students themselves taking leadership in continuing the transformation. Later, during the reception inside the new Taylor Center, Ethan found himself standing beside Dr. Hargrove near a display case containing memorabilia from the events 5 years earlier, including a framed newspaper showing 3 military helicopters landed on the school's east field. Quite the legacy, the former headmaster observed quietly. Not what either of us expected that day in your office, Ethan replied. Dr. Hargrove nodded thoughtfully. You know, in all my years in education, I prided myself on identifying potential, yet I completely missed yours. He shook his head with rueful self-awareness. The most valuable lesson of my career came in recognizing how my own biases had blinded me. That's a lesson worth learning, Ethan acknowledged, even if the method was unconventional. The older man chuckled softly. Indeed, though, I sometimes wonder what might have happened if I'd simply listened to you and your father that day, if I'd been able to see past my preconceptions. Perhaps we could have achieved this transformation without quite so much drama. Perhaps, Ethan conceded, but sometimes systems need dramatic confrontation before they're willing to change. The important thing is that when that moment came, Westridge ultimately chose growth over defensiveness. Due in no small part to your mother's persuasive approach, Dr. Hargrove noted dryly. This drew a genuine laugh from Ethan, a tactical deployment of resources, as they'd call it at West Point. Their conversation was interrupted as Sarah approached, now accompanied by Sophia Rivera and several current student leaders who were explaining the peer advocacy program they had developed through the Taylor Center. Ethan, Sarah said, these students have developed something remarkable. Their peer advocacy initiative has become a model for other schools in the program. As Ethan engaged with the students, Dr. Hargrove quietly excused himself, making his way across the reception to where Jack Taylor stood, examining architectural drawings of future expansions to the center. Mr. Taylor, he greeted him with genuine respect, I was just reflecting with your son on the extraordinary journey that brought us all here today. Jack nodded, his expression thoughtful. Life rarely follows the paths we expect, Dr. Hargrove. Sometimes the most important journeys begin with what looks like a wrong turn. Indeed, the former headmaster agreed, though I suspect you and your wife had a clearer vision of the possibilities than I did. A slight smile crossed Jack's weathered face. Sarah's always been the strategist in our family. I'm just a farmer who believes in standing up for what's right. I think you're considerably more than that, Dr. Hargrove replied. The values your son demonstrated that day, the ones that ultimately transformed this institution, those weren't learned from military strategy. They were learned from watching a man work his land with integrity, treating everyone with the same respect, regardless of their station. Jack studied the former headmaster with new appreciation. You've done some growing yourself these past 5 years. Necessary growth, Dr. Hargrove acknowledged, though rather late in my career. Better late than never, Jack replied simply. That's another thing about farming. You learn that growth happens in its own season, not always when you expect it. As the afternoon progressed, the formal reception gradually transitioned to a more casual gathering. Students led tours of the new facility, proudly showcasing the peer mentoring spaces, Educational Equity Research Center, and community outreach programs housed within the Taylor Center. Ethan found himself standing with his parents near the large windows overlooking the campus, the same view he had once believed he was losing forever when he'd been suspended. "Did you ever imagine this?" he asked them quietly, gesturing toward the building around them, the diverse student body, the transformed institution. "That day when we drove home from my suspension meeting," Sarah smiled thoughtfully. "I knew something would change, though perhaps not quite so, comprehensively." "Your mother always thinks 10 moves ahead," Jack added with affectionate pride. "It's what makes her such a formidable strategist. But strategy alone doesn't create transformation," Sarah countered. "What truly changed Westridge wasn't helicopters or high-ranking officials or media attention. It was the moral authority that comes from standing up for what's right, especially at personal cost. That's what you demonstrated, Ethan." As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the campus, the Taylor family stood, together on the steps of the building that now bore their name. Before them stretched the grounds of Westridge Academy, its Georgian architecture unchanged, yet somehow transformed by the new understanding that had emerged from that confrontational day 5 years earlier. "Your grandfather would have been proud," Jack said quietly to Ethan, "not of the building or the recognition, but of the young man you've become." Ethan nodded, thinking of the hand-stitched sampler that still hung in their farmhouse kitchen. "Character is how you treat those who can do nothing for you." "I learned from the best," he replied simply. As they prepared to depart, Sarah to return to her duties, Ethan to West Point, Jack to the farm that had shaped their family's values, they paused for one final look at the Taylor Center, now illuminated. Against the gathering dusk, what had begun as a moment of injustice had transformed not just one institution, but educational approaches nationwide. The ripples continued to spread outward, touching lives far beyond what any of them could have imagined that autumn day 5 years earlier. "You know what this means, don't you?" Sarah said, echoing Ethan's words from that day on the field. "You've created a legacy that goes far beyond military service or academic achievement." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "A legacy of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult." "Especially when it's difficult," Jack corrected gently. "That's when it matters most." As they walked away, Ethan glanced back one last time at the building that bore their name, not as a monument to power or prestige, but as a testament to the transformative potential of moral courage. The true legacy of that extraordinary day wasn't measured in policy changes or new buildings, but in the countless students who would learn that the most powerful form of leadership begins with the courage to stand alone when necessary, guided by an unwavering commitment to what is right. The lessons of that day continued to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond Westridge Academy's iron gates, a reminder that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with a single act of courage. 10 years later, Brigadier General Ethan Taylor stood at the podium in West Point's historic Thayer Hall, addressing the incoming class of cadets. At 31, the youngest general in the modern army, his rise through the ranks had been as remarkable as it was well-earned. "Leadership," he told the attentive cadets before him, "is often misunderstood as a function of rank or authority. True leadership begins long before you earn your first insignia. It begins with the willingness to stand for what's right, especially when doing so comes at personal cost." His gaze swept across the diverse faces before him, young men and women, from every background and circumstance, united by their commitment to service. When I was 16, he continued, I faced a moment that would ultimately shape my understanding of leadership more profoundly than any tactical exercise or battlefield simulation I've encountered since. It wasn't a dramatic moment by military standards, simply standing between a bully and his target in a school dining hall. But the consequences of that choice taught me something essential about moral courage. The cadets listened intently as General Taylor recounted the story that had become legendary at West Point, how a farmer's son suspended for defending a classmate had catalyzed a national movement for educational equity. The lesson wasn't in the dramatic resolution, he emphasized. It wasn't about helicopters landing or high-ranking interventions. It was about the moment of choice, that quiet internal decision to do what's right, even when it's easier to look away. As his address concluded, a cadet raised her hand during the question period. General Taylor, what would you say to someone facing that kind of choice today, standing up against injustice when there might be personal consequences? Ethan considered the question thoughtfully, remembering his 16-year-old self standing in Dr. Hargrove's office, facing what had seemed like the end of his educational opportunities. I would tell them what my father taught me growing up on our farm, he replied, that the true measure of character isn't found in the moments when doing right is easy or advantageous. It's found in those quiet moments when you think no one who matters is watching, when standing up might cost you something valuable. He paused, his expression reflective, and I would tell them that sometimes what appears to be the end of one path is actually the beginning of a more important journey, one that not only transforms your own life, but creates ripples that touch countless others. As the cadets rose in respectful applause at the conclusion of his address, General Taylor's gaze caught on the portrait of Sylvanus Thayer, the father of West Point, that hung on the wall behind him. Thayer had transformed the military academy nearly 2 centuries earlier, establishing principles of leadership and character that continued to guide its mission. In a similar way, the confrontation at Westridge Academy 15 years earlier had transformed not just one institution, but educational approaches nationwide. What had begun as a simple act of standing up for someone who needed help had created ripples that continued to expand outward, touching lives far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Later that evening, as General Taylor prepared to return to Washington, he received a message from his father. Attached was a photograph of the Taylor Center for Educational Equity, now expanded to 3 buildings on the Westridge campus, with a simple caption, "Your grandfather always said true leadership isn't about making people follow you, it's about showing them what's worth following." Ethan smiled, thinking of the weathered hands that had typed those words, hands that had taught him the value of honest work, integrity, and standing up for what was right. The lessons of the farm had served him as well in military leadership as any tactical training. What had begun that day in a prep school dining hall had never really been about him, or even about one institution's policies. It had been about the ripple effect that occurs when someone chooses to do what's right, regardless of personal cost. Ripples that continue to expand outward, touching lives in ways that can never be fully measured. That understanding had guided General Taylor through every leadership challenge he had faced since, the knowledge that true leadership begins not with authority, but with the moral courage to stand up for what's right, especially when you stand alone. It was a lesson worth passing on to the next generation of leaders, one not learned from textbooks or simulations, but from that moment of choice that comes to everyone sooner or later. The quiet decision to stand up, speak out, and do what's right regardless of the consequences. That, after all, was the legacy that mattered most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.